This is almost certainly going to go down as my most glacial take of all time. It's been almost half a decade since anything I'm about to say was really relevant, and I'm pretty sure that everyone has already stopped doing the thing I said to stop doing in the title. And I guess a bit of backstory is in order, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. When I started making YouTube videos back in spring of 2015, Danmachi was the biggest show of the season, and everyone was comparing it to the then biggest show of the decade, Sword Art Online. Back then, long before I was the world's premier expert in why SAO is badology, the frequent comparisons between these two series really bothered me. Dismissing Danmachi as an SAO clone, I believe, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what both series are, why people were drawn to either of them in the first place, and what makes SAO so disappointing to so many of us weebs. I guess I could have made a video about this then, but I was new to YouTubing and I thought of myself as just the anime openings guy, so I let it go. Or I thought I did anyway, but when Danmachi came back 4 years later, so did all of those niggling thoughts about the early community criticism of the show. And I felt this pressing need to use my now more versatile and sizable YouTube platform to mount some kind of counter-defense against it, even though it's already stopped. Honestly, I can't tell you why I'm making this. I like Danmachi, but I don't love it. I don't think it's some masterpiece. It's not even a personal favorite. It's just a good show with maybe a bit more depth than most people give it credit for. There are many great anime from the summer that are definitely more deserving of a video spotlight. But I just keep thinking about this. I've been thinking about it all summer, and during this one brief seasonal transition when Danmachi 2 is going out and Alicization 2 is coming in, the stars have aligned to simultaneously put both of these series near the apex of their searchability. In this fleeting window of time, if I talk about them, the almighty YouTube algorithm might just make a lot of people listen. So I can get this off my chest now or try to let it go forever. And since option B clearly has not worked, fuck it, let's do this. Now, to be fair to the other side of this discussion, even if they haven't been actually having the discussion for a couple years now, Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon is a video gamey fantasy adventure anime based on a light novel with harem elements and an OP protagonist that premiered just a year after SAO 2, so I can definitely see why people would draw so many parallels between them. Especially at a time when the market for such things was a lot less crowded than it is today, and the similarities between them thus stood out a lot more than their differences. Moreover, given the timing of its release, it's probably fair to assume that the decision to greenlight Danmachi was directly influenced by the wild success of SAO, and both shows are aimed primarily at an audience of geeky young men looking for a bit of escapist wish fulfillment, so if your primary gripe with SAO is that it's trashy, indulgent otaku bait, it probably makes a lot of sense to lump Danmachi in with it. However, dig any deeper than that, and the similarities quickly run dry. One point that fans of Danmachi often bring up to deflect these comparisons is that the series isn't isekai, it's fantasy. To me, that argument doesn't really hold water, since many writers just treat the isekai premise as a way to avoid writing a backstory for their fantasy heroes, but moreover, it misses what makes Danmachi special. Danmachi isn't just a fantasy story. It's a romantic comedy set in a fantasy world. Harems, love interests, and comedic elements obviously aren't uncommon in fantasy and isekai anime, but they're usually incidental to the sword fighting and the questing and all the other fantasy stuff that you're presumably there for. Danmachi flips that balance on its head. Bell does spend a lot of his time doing cool anime fights with monsters in a dungeon, but that's just his job, not his whole life. His ultimate goal isn't to save the world or destroy evil or anything heroic like that. His main goal is to win the love of Eyes Wallenstein. Becoming a hero is just a means to that end. Being a rom-com affords Danmachi a lot more space than your average fantasy series has to really explore how its characters live and how its world works. And while the idea of a fantasy land that operates on dungeon crawler logic isn't exactly new, Danmachi does a really good job of fleshing out its particular take on this well-worn concept. The politics of its world, where everybody's abilities are objectively quantifiable and the horny asshole gods of antiquity live alongside mankind day to day, are especially interesting. to me at least. SAO, in contrast, is a much more conventional adventure story, where the goal of each arc is to locate, reach, and defeat a big bad guy to stop him or her from doing the bad things. The show's primary focus is action, and it only really engages in world building to the extent that is necessary to facilitate plot progression and get Kirito to the next fight. There is a heavy undercurrent of romance to its story, but those elements are almost always played straight to create drama and fuel conflict. You wouldn't call it a rom-com. I'm not saying these differences make Danmachi better necessarily, just that they make it very different as Shaun of the Dead is from Dawn of the Dead. And while the shows have commonalities, and there's likely a significant overlap in their audiences, that difference in genre fundamentally changes how those common elements work within their respective stories. For example, both shows have overpowered protagonists. Bel Crenel has this special cheat ability that increases his rate of EXP gain in direct proportion to his feelings for eyes, so with a bit of practice, he can rapidly become skilled at basically anything, and Kirito, for his part, already is skilled at basically everything. He's so good at sword fighting that he's the top player in several fantasy RPGs and a shooter somehow, on top of being a programming whiz, and that's all at 14 years old. I've talked before about how this stretches the show's believability and diminishes its narrative stakes, which makes it harder to take seriously, but that's only an issue because SAO really demands to be taken seriously. The real problem with Kirito isn't just that he's unbelievably overpowered, but that the show he's overpowered in sells itself as this dark, tense science fantasy thriller with extreme life or death stakes, and his existence simply isn't consistent with those narrative ambitions. He takes the tension out of every fight. He and his harem have the thickest plot armor imaginable, which kind of kills the whole death game idea, and his superhero level abilities really clash with the show's attempted grimdark tone. That's not nearly as much of a problem for almost any other kind of story, really, but in comedy especially, the way that overpowered heroes diminish tension can be a good thing. That's the whole central gag of One Punch Man, after all. Danmachi doesn't really go for that kind of anticlimactic humor, but its core appeal lies in its character interactions, not the stakes of its narrative conflicts. So it doesn't hurt it nearly as much if the conclusion of its fights are foregone. Whether or not a character is too OP largely depends on what you want to use them for. It's mainly a question of context, though it is also a question of degrees, and it's worth noting that Bel is a lot less OP than Kirito. While he pulls off some amazing feats with relatively little experience, Bel is almost never the strongest guy in the room. He just has the potential to be. Plenty of monsters and humans pose a legitimate threat that he must overcome through a combination of conveniently accelerated hard work and ingenuity, which makes Danmachi's fights, on average, more exciting and tense than those in SAO, even though they don't really have to be. Bel does not strike me as a character whose sole reason for existing is to make nerds feel good about themselves, and I think that much is self-evident from Danmachi's inciting incident. In the context of escapist fantasy, there's something almost poetically subversive about a wimpy wannabe hero who dreams of saving the day and getting the girl, falling for a swordswoman who is immensely stronger than him because she saved his dopey ass from a monster. Essentially, Bel falls prey to the very same suspension bridge effect that his grandpa told him to exploit to get laid. Not that he needed it, because when he's not soaked in blood, it turns out he's a bit of a babe magnet, which isn't so subversive, and that's something that often gets brought up when comparing him to Kirito. He's wimpy, soft, a far cry from the manly hero he dreams of being, yet from the very first episode, he's got a harem of hotties hanging off his arm that only gets bigger as the series goes on. Hastia's been in love with him since they first met. Lily, his first adventuring partner, develops a huge crush on him pretty quickly. Ryu and Seer, the waitresses at his favorite pub, both adore him, and for some reason, love goddesses just really like stalking him. At a surface level, this does look an awful lot like a common trope that plagues isekai anime and escapist anime in general, where the entire female cast instantly falls for an audience insert hero solely for the purpose of making that audience feel good about itself. As someone who loves more than his share of harem anime, though, I think that whether that's a good or bad thing is another question of context. In my view, this kind of gratuitous harem building only becomes a problem when it undermines the integrity of the characters joining the harem. A good character should never do anything, including fall in love, without having a reason to do it that's consistent with their established motivations and personality. And the issue that so many bad isekai, SAO especially, run into is that their bland, blank slate heroes don't possess any personality traits that a remotely interesting character could conceivably fall for. Bell's different though. He has a strong, clearly defined personality. He's modest, kind-hearted, emotionally open, naive, horny on main, unflappably optimistic, and willing to believe in anyone, no matter how worthless they or anyone else might think they are. And in a town full of self-obsessed gods and mean, cynical, macho-posturing braggarts like Loga, it's not hard to see how that would make him a real catch. Moreover, when you examine his individual relationships with any of the girls pursuing him, not only is there obvious chemistry in all of their interactions, something that's completely absent when, say, Lisbeth or Silica talks to Kirito, but within the story, you can almost always pinpoint a specific thing he did that sparked their feelings for him. And it's almost always something more personal and touching than he killed a monster and looked cool doing it. Comparing Bell and Kirito's relationship pages on their respective fan wikis will show you just how big the difference between them really is. Almost every girl on Bell's page has a reason for liking him, while every entry on Kirito's page boils down to some shit happened, he saved her life, now she wants some fuck. Of course, Danmachi is only able to deliver such resonant romantic elements because all of its characters are so deep and well written. Relatively speaking, of course. It is still pop fantasy at its core, and many of its characters are archetypal and cliched, but anyone with a name and face in the show will at least generally also have a bit of backstory and some distinguishing personality quirks. Those traits are expanded upon for recurring characters who also tend to have coherent goals, values, and desires that drive their actions and inform their behavior. The show's core cast, meanwhile, particularly the Hestia Familia, all experience consistent growth and development at least a little during every arc that they play a major role in, and often the adventures they get caught up in are directly related to either the backstories or motivations of one of those core cast members. None of this is revolutionary. These are all fairly basic examples of what good character writing looks like, and those details aren't going to make you like any of these characters more if their personalities turn you off to begin with, but whether you like the characters or not, these details do make them feel more believable and three-dimensional, which also goes a long way, by proxy, toward making the cool, interesting world that they inhabit feel more believable as well. They're not just names attached to basic descriptions of appearance and attitude that exist solely to do plot-advancing things to, with, or in the vicinity of the protagonist, and then disappear forever, which is every non-recurring character in SAO. The recurring ones, meanwhile, mostly just show up with a problem they need Kirito's help to solve, experience a bit of growth and learn a lesson as they solve it, and then proceed to hang around in his and Asuna's orbit doing nothing and never changing forever. And that's not entirely to the show's detriment. It enhances the focus on Kirito's achievements, which supports the show's goal of delivering a cathartic power fantasy to its viewers, and it creates a certain sense of comfortable, sitcom-esque familiarity with the supporting cast. Danmachi has different goals. It needs a big, diverse cast of characters to hammer home its core themes of found family, community, friendship, and collaboration. SAO's more about individual triumph, so its supporting characters can't afford to be less well-defined. But that approach does limit what can be done with them. Danmachi's supporting cast is rich enough to take the spotlight in story arcs alongside or even without Bell. There's enough depth to the Loki Familia that they can carry an entire side series of storylines on their own. Much as I personally love Klein and the motley group of doofuses that makes up his guild, I don't think that you could do the same with them or any of SAO's supporting characters, really. There's a reason that the writers of the alternative spin-offs have chosen to tell stories with their own original casts. Why the games all have to invent new, more interesting waifus for their plots to happen to. SAO has proven to be great spin-off fodder, but its value in that regard comes mainly from its setting, which, to give credit where it's due, is a lot more original in concept than Danmachi's, and while it's not nearly as fleshed out, it does have an innate aesthetic appeal that makes it seem like it would be a really cool place to be in, so long as a video game's not trying to murder you. And to be clear, that's not the only thing I think SAO has over Danmachi. Its animation is generally slicker, its music is more memorable, and I think it does a better job of creating a sense of atmosphere. I've been focusing on Danmachi's strengths and SAO's weaknesses because that's what's easiest for me to write about, but the point of this video is not to say that Danmachi is a strictly better anime than SAO, it's to establish that the two series have fundamentally different strengths, weaknesses, and narrative goals, and that those differences merit significantly different approaches to how we critically examine the two works. And again, that's probably not necessary for me to say, since the range of anime about dudes doing sword fights in video gamey worlds is a lot wider now than it was half a decade ago, which likely means that anime viewers are better equipped to pick up on those differences intuitively, and that they probably won't make these kinds of comparisons again. But I think these observations may have value in informing how we talk about whatever the next big anime craze is, and I like putting into words the things that we all let go unsaid, and yeah, I really just needed to get this all off my chest for my sake. But hopefully the icy nature of this take has been refreshing in its own way for all of you. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the video and my arguments, especially if you think I've overlooked some obvious connection between these series. And if you haven't seen them yet, make sure you check out my review of Alicization and my serious scientific breakdown of what makes Hestia the Bestia. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.